Norman French was the official court language of the English crown since the time William became king. So, how and when did the transition of French to English as the court language happen in English monarchy? Was it during the Tudor era? Okay, interesting question. We're talking about history now. so, uh, so you're right. Norman French became the official court language of England uh, from the year 1066 onwards. The year 1066 was the year that William the Bastard became William the Conqueror. Okay, he was an illegitimate son of his father. And his father had to go on a crusade, and he had no legitimate children, so he was forced to declare that his illegitimate son William was the heir to the Duchy of Normandy, to become the next Duke of Normandy if he did not come back from the crusade. And as it happened, he died in the crusade or on the way or wherever. So this young boy, I don't know, he was 11, 12, whatever his age was, he was illegitimate. He became the Duke of Normandy. And for the rest of his career, for a significant portion of his life, he was called William the Bastard. But the year 1066, he crossed the English Channel with a bunch of ships, and he landed. Where did he land? Hastings? Yeah, probably Hastings. No, Stamford Bridge. One of these two battles. And the poor English king, Harold, he had to fight two battles in a week. One battle against the Vikings, led by Harald Hardrada and a traitor brother, Harold's own brother. So he wins that battle. He gives Harold Hardrada what he asked for, 6 feet of land in England. And then he hears word that a Norman force has landed all the way down south. So he has to march his exhausted army hundreds of kilometers all the way down south. And then he meets uh, William at Hastings, I believe. And yeah, he gets unlucky. He catches an arrow in his eye, and that's the story. Uh, so that's how the Normans conquered England. That is the last time ever that England was successfully conquered, the year 1066. And that's the year that Norman French becomes the official court language. So before that, before Norman French, you had the Anglo-Saxon language, that which is Old English. That was the court language in France, and uh, Britain was invaded by Angles and Saxons, two Germanic tribes, around 410 or so AD. Okay, the leaders of the invaders were Hengist and Horsa, the stallion and the horse. So that's when the Anglo-Saxon language entered England. Okay, before that you had Latin, the language of the Romans, because the Romans had conquered England, starting with Julius Caesar. So Latin was the official court language as long as the Romans were there. And before the Romans arrived in England, where you had various Celtic languages that were, or Brittonic languages, Pictish, Scottish, Brittonic, Celtic languages, etc., which were the official court languages, which would have been the official court languages. So 1066, Norman French becomes the court language. Now what happens is, and it remains the court language of and the prestige language, the language of the elites, for at least a couple of centuries. For example, one of the greatest of the English kings is Richard the Lionheart, right? He lived in the 12th century AD, the son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. And Richard the Lionheart spoke Norman French, or French. He spoke French, and his banner, his flag was the Angevin lions. So French was the language of the elites. It was the court language. It was a prestige language. It was considered to be prestigious to speak French. Uh, Now, by the 13th century, the language had kind of changed. The Norman French language spoken by the elites had changed considerably. The syntax had become much more like English, and some of these nobles just gave up Norman French and started speaking English. Now, so in the 14th century, so at this time you have Middle English. The Anglo-Saxon language before William was Old English. By the 14th century, you have something called Middle English. And one of the most important works of English literature is the Canterbury Tales, written by Geoffrey Chaucer, which was written in the 14th century, and it was written in Middle English, one of the most important works in English literature. And it depicts a storytelling contest by a group of pilgrims as they traveled together from London to Canterbury, okay, to visit the shrine of a saint, Thomas Becket, at Canterbury Cathedral. Thomas Becket was a, a troublesome or meddlesome or turbulent priest who was assassinated, stabbed in the 12th century, in the second half of the 12th century AD. And he was assassinated because the king, the father of Richard the Lionheart, Henry II, he said to no one in general, will no one get, no, will no one rid me of this troublesome priest? So he said this in his court with his knights present, but he did not order anybody to go and assassinate the guy. But it was considered to be an order. And a couple of his guys went ahead and did the assassination. So that I'm digressing now. It's a different story. So in the 14th century, Middle English was spoken by the people of England, but Norman French was still kind of the elite language or the prestige language. Then in the 14th and 15th centuries, you had the Hundred-Year War between England and France. It uh, it was set off when the King of England made a claim to the throne of France because the French king died without leaving an heir and all that. So during this 100-year war between England and France, French came to be seen as the language of the enemy, and that's when the whole tide changed. The tide turned, and the aristocracy, the elites, also adopted Middle English as the court language. Uh, so you're talking about the Tudor era, obviously. So you had a transition from the Norman era, which is the lineage of Henry of William the Conqueror, which still exists today. Every single king or queen since 1066 AD has been a direct descendant of William the Conqueror. But there was this period which was the Norman period, when the kings were outright Normans. Kings and queens were outright Normans. Then you had the Plantagenet era. Their last king was Richard III, the guy with the hunchback. He had scoliosis. His skeleton was recently discovered after half a millennium in obscurity. So the last Plantagenet king died in the Battle of Bosworth Field. He lost to Henry VII, Henry Tudor, and that's the beginning of the Tudor period, which starts in the late 1400s and goes all the way to the beginning of the 17th century, which included the Elizabethan era. So that's the Tudor period in which the court language was whatever English was spoken at the time, Middle English or whatever. But it's not during the Tudor era that the language changed. It changed during the Hundred Years' War between the English and the French. That's the 13th. That's the 14th and 15th centuries. But very interesting question, because it shows you how languages change, languages evolve. You had Celtic languages, then you had Latin, then you had the Anglo-Saxon language, Old English, then you had the Norman French period, then you had Middle English, and then you have uh, Shakespearean English, and then present day English. Very interesting mechanics and dynamics of change, linguistic change, societal change, and so on.